Well, hey, all you virtual winos, it's Wes Hagen. I'm the consulting winemaker for the Miller Family Wine Company, as well as the brand ambassador for the same. We make Barrel Burner, J. Wilkes, Smashberry, and Ballard Lane wines. But today, in the middle of harvest, I'm going to be recording this wonderful video for you guys, a seminar for SommCon, and it's going to be all about the history of wine from Pangea to Pasteur. And let's go ahead and jump right in. So without a teleprompter, without a spit bucket, we're going right off the cuff. So we're going to start by seeing just a little bit of a video, the beginning of grapes, because really grapevines only have one function in nature. They grow up a tree, they steal the tree's light. Oftentimes they can even kill the tree as a parasite, and then use the dead tree in the forest canopy for absorbing sunlight and turning that sunlight into carbohydrates for growth. And then when the grapevines reach the sunlight, to activate the dormant buds to be fruitful the subsequent year. So basically, if the sun can see the fruit, that means there's enough leaves to achieve ripeness. And if ripeness achieved, that means the animals are going to come and eat the fruit and disperse the seeds. So a grapevine is a biological and botanical system for basically spreading its own seeds. And how does it do that? It grows, it produces fruit, it entices animals to eat it. And basically that's exactly where we're going on that. All right, so brand new evidence from about 2 years ago that extends the history of wine back more years than we thought. Originally, we had the archaeological sites of Areni and Tbilisi. This actually extends the ceramic evidence for wine production back another 700 to 800 years. And 8,000 years ago, these ceramic vessels were being used in Tbilisi, Georgia for the fermentation of wine. How do we know it was a fermenting vessel? Well, A, it really doesn't have any handles, or the handles are not there. It is basically a kvevré. So this is a vessel that would have been buried into the ground and used for fermentation. You can see not only is it an 8,000-year-old ceramic vessel used for wine. How do we know that? Well, on B, C, and D, Dr. Patrick McGovern, world's leading bioarchaeologist of wine and fermented beverages, found both malvidin and tartaric acid embedded in the molecular structure of this old ceramic. So we know that there was wine inside of it. Plus we have some beautiful grape motifs on this kvevré. Remember that a kvevré is generally used for fermentation, and an amphora or amphore are used for transport. So if we're talking about fermentation, let's use the correct term of kvevré. And if we're talking about transport, then we'd look at amphore. Awesome. So this is Tbilisi, Georgia, and this is the actual winery that is being excavated. This is where they found the pottery jars and the residue. And certainly this is a very big point in wine history. And obviously as archaeology moves forward, and sites like Areni, which is a site as well as a city, as well as a grape variety in Armenia, they've only scratched the surface of some of these old caves. So what I'll think we'll continue to find is more evidence of winemaking that might even extend past ceramic production in Europe, which goes back to 6,500 BCE, or about 8,500 years ago. So right now we're pretty much stuck with archaeological evidence that is in ceramic. So ceramic is generally needed to carbon date old wineries and stuff like that. So Dr. Patrick McGovern, one of my, a friend of mine, as well as someone I love to read, he wrote The Origin and Ancient History of Wine. He wrote Uncorking the Past, and he wrote Ancient Ales. All these books should be on your list. Fermented beverages have been preferred over water throughout the ages. They're safer, provide psychotropic effects, i.e. they get us high, and are more nutritious. Remember that 1 gram of ethanol has the nutriment equivalent of 4 grams of carbohydrates. Some have even said that alcohol was the primary agent for the development of Western civilization, since more healthy individuals, even if they're a little inebriated much of the time, lived longer and had greater reproductive success. So pretty clear from archaeological perspective that alcohol was a very important part of our society. Obviously, it helped people live longer. It helped people celebrate. It helped people get naked more often. And it helped the reproductive success. And I think you all know what that means without me putting up a slide to describe it. So with alcohol in ancient societies, remember, obviously alcohol predates this idea of ceramic by tens of thousands of years. I mean, did Australopithecine afarensis sip from fermented honey in a fallen tree in the Olduvai Gorge 7 million years ago? Well, of course. Or 3 million years ago, I should say. Of course they did. I mean, basically, think about Naked and Afraid. Anytime you find something edible in the wild, you're going to eat it. And if you find something as wonderful as something fermented, either oozing fruit or honey mixed with water, or if it was even purposeful, made in a stone basin that didn't survive to the modern day, of course, alcohol would be used by any creature. And we'll explain why in a little bit. It obviously cements these reciprocal relationships within a culture: social, celebratory, economic, and sexual. It acts as social lubrication at gatherings and in daily life. And man, if you think a drink tastes good at the end of your day, think about taking a drink at the end of sort of the Chalcolithic or the Paleolithic period, where you didn't get eaten by a saber-toothed tiger, you didn't get stung by a scorpion, you weren't brained by another warring tribe, or if you were a Neanderthal, you maybe Homo habilis left you alone for a day and you actually took a sip of alcohol. You only lived into your 20s or 30s. And so just getting through a day would be pretty amazing. And having a drink or some fermented fruit would, elevate us to a point where it would almost seem magical and shamanistic. So these shamanistic rituals can be argued to have led to spirituality and religion. I'm vibing a little bit on Food of the Gods, which is a book basically written about how early experimentation in pre-humans with psychedelic compounds may have led to consciousness and or a changing of consciousness. And that's a pretty cool stuff. And obviously there's good stuff in Dr. Patrick McGovern's about how alcohol, spirituality, and shamanistic religion was emerging at exactly the same time that these fermented beverages were being made more regularly and available to human beings more obviously. And then yeast, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, is absolutely, positively humanity's oldest and most important industrial microbe. Is there anything that yeast can't do? It bakes bread, it makes wine, it can be used in preservation and some types of pickling. So obviously yeast is incredibly important to the development of humankind and humanity. So this is Pangaea. And when 200 million years ago or 300 million years ago, when Pangaea was all connected right there, you'll basically see one grape variety from the archaeological record, which was Vitis ampelopsis. And Vitis ampelopsis breaks out into two major subspecies: the Eurasian subspecies, which makes more fermentable sugar than any fruit on the planet and makes the strongest alcoholic beverage on the planet, wine, without distillation. And in in America, there's the American subspecies of grapes, which generally makes crappy booze and no one really wants to talk about. So we're going to really be talking about the Eurasian subspecies of grapes. Interesting that Vitis vinifera, Vitis vinifera sylvestris, Vitis vinifera vinifera does not really naturally exist in Africa or South America, but obviously was taken to the Southern Hemisphere later on in wine history that we won't be talking about, and planted in regions down there. We'll talk a little bit about where grapes exist today. Okay, so that's Louis Pasteur. So we're going Pangaea to Pasteur. So I'm kind of bookending this, and Pasteur had no interest in milk. In fact, dude probably even didn't drink milk because he loved beer. In fact, you could argue that pasteurization, all this stuff was due to beer. Basically the entire world is due to beer. And if you haven't seen on YouTube, you can look up how beer changed or how beer saved the world, which is absolutely de rigueur for anyone who's interested in fermentation history. So Louis Pasteur was using Leeuwenhoek's microscope, compound microscope, to try to find out why beer goes bad. Boom, basically develops germ theory, which is the basis for all clinical medicine in the world today. So as a side effect of the study of fermentation, we end up with germ theory, and we end up with an understanding. And pre-Pasteur, guys moved from cadavers to live surgery in a medical condition. After Pasteur, they washed their hands. So thank you, beer, for another 30 to 40 years probably of life on top of what we would expect back in the 19th century. And thank you, Louis Pasteur, for doing such wonderful work. So let's fill in the middle. We're going to talk a little bit about alcohol and how we catch a buzz without dying. What is the evolutionary process of allowing humans and other animals to consume ethanol without being toxified? Beer, we're going to talk about beer, but we're going to really probably give that beer stuff just a couple minutes, but really encourage you guys to watch How Beer Saved the World. Vitis vinifera from the Caucasus through Europe via Romans, Gauls, the birds, that's an oversimplification. We have Carthaginians, we have Greeks, we have Canaanites, so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then, can I actually prove in 3 minutes or less that wine is poetically responsible for all modern medical, microbiological, and cosmological science? Yes, I can, and I'll do so. So first of all, let's talk a little bit about why yeast, why alcohol, why does yeast produce alcohol? And is it true hundreds of millions of years ago, these single-celled fungi, yeast, were actually creating some of the first chemical energy by molecular bond change. So if you look at what on this planet first had a molecular bond change that created energy, you could probably argue that it was yeast. And why do yeast produce alcohol? Well, this is not millions and millions of years. This is not 300 million years ago, but just within the last few millions of years, obviously, that alcohol and ethanol is produced by yeast that are eating overripe fruit to protect their fruit source from other hungry critters, producing a toxic byproduct from glycolysis and fermentation. So you know exactly what I'm talking about. If you have a brother or a sister and you got a Twinkie as a kid and you had to go someplace and leave your Twinkie, and you know your brother or sister was going to eat your Twinkie, so maybe what do? You lick your Twinkie and you put it on the table and go, okay, eat my Twinkie now. See, that's what yeast do. They produce this toxic byproduct called ethanol that would discourage other animals from eating their food source of gooey, oozing, overripe fruit. So then evolution favored the critters who could better tolerate or metabolize that ethanol, as it gave them access to the ripest fruit and the economic, nutritional, and euphoric dividend that it provides. Nice way of saying alcohol feeds you, alcohol gives you energy, and alcohol makes your brain feel funny and good. And almost all humans, except some Asians, produce a variant of this enzyme that actually causes them to flush when they drink alcohol. But most non-Asian cultures produce quite a bit of this wonderful ALDH1 enzyme, which is an alcohol dehydrogenase enzyme for breaking down ethanol into energy. So yeast takes sugar and turns it into basically pyruvate to aldehyde to acetate to ethanol. That's a very, actually that's a little bit backwards, but and then our livers actually reverse the process and turn ethanol back into acetate that we can absolutely absorb as energy in our life. So 10% of our liver's enzymatic function is to produce this dehydrogenase enzyme. And as a result, I like to say that we should use 10% of our calorie intake daily by using alcohol. So a glass of red wine or 2 glasses of red wine for men, 1 glass for women. Generally, because of breast cancer rates go up higher after 1 glass a day for women. If you have a doctor that says that, buy a bigger glass. No, I'm just kidding, sort of. But I would say that if 10% of our liver's enzymatic function is to produce an enzyme for breaking down alcohol in the bloodstream, we should take that seriously, whether you believe you were created with a liver that does this or like me, evolved to have a liver like this. It sounds like we need to take 10% of our daily calorie intake in the form of red wine for the best health benefit, which is exactly the amount that we would expect on that 10% rule. So as I mentioned, about 200 million years ago, when the continents cracked apart, we had Vitis amplopsis break into the American and Eurasian subspecies. The Eurasian wine grape, Vitis vinifera sylvestris, it dies in each ice age and then manages to survive in isolated pockets, usually near water. The last ice age broke down maybe about 12,000 years ago, and then we had a little mini ice age, but basically left Vitis vinifera sylvestris isolated in the Transcaucasus between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. And then right there, about 10,000 years ago, we expect that there was a domestication event in this area that led the Neolithic and Chalcolithic people to a perfected grapevine. So before this, grapevines were male and female. They were dioecious. And then there was a discovery of a mutated grapevine somewhere in the forests of the Caucasus that humans domesticated a vine that was perfected. It was monoecious. It had both male and female parts on every berry. And I'll show you that. So the color picture on the right is a male rootstock rooting that kind of came up out of the ground. That's an American grapevine, and that is a male American grapevine. That is a vine that all it does is it flowers and produces. You'll notice that all the tiny little flowers, they almost look like saffron, white saffron. Those are producing pollen, but they won't produce fruit. So not going to do us much good having a bunch of pollen flying around if we don't have any grapes to make wine. So the other illustrations on the left show sort of up on the sort of top middle, you can see that the cap is starting to kind of pull off of the grapevine. We call that cap fall. After the cap falls out, the flowers emerge like bottom middle. And you can see, and the ladies will appreciate this, that for every female part, the ova or the ovary, you basically have 5 male parts surrounding it. And so this perfected hermaphroditic vine doesn't have to get dressed up, doesn't go clubbing. And every female part has 5 males surrounding it. Anyways, that is going to be an incredibly efficient way of, so it doesn't need to get dressed up, doesn't need to go clubbing, it stays at home and pollinates itself with amazing rapidity and efficiency. And we go from a dioecious vine that might 5% pollination rate on its berries to a perfected monoecious vine that pollinates 95 to 100% of all clusters. So we go from clusters with a couple berries on them to clusters with basically fully jeweled clusters that would certainly get someone's attention when they saw that mutated perfected vine in the forest. So cuttings were taken, or the vine was layered from ground up and then ground and then up and then ground, or the seeds were taken. My guess, it was probably cuttings or layering to produce the first domesticated vine, the first domesticated vineyard. Maybe the trees were continued to used as trellising. I doubt that there was really much trellising going on way back then, 9,000–10,000 years ago. And this is the area where it happened. And you can see a couple stars in areas that we know that there's early winemaking archaeological evidence. Obviously, we're seeing in Armenia and in Georgia and Tbilisi, over there in Azerbaijan and Baku. You can see a couple of these early wine sites. This is an Italian map that'll show a little bit of the Caucasus viticultural areas up between the Black Sea, Mar Negro, and Mar Caspio. You'll see right there is some of the earliest areas where we find archaeological evidence. Down south of the Caspian Sea, you can see the viticultural area of Persia. Further down than that, between the Tigris and the Euphrates, you're going to, of course, see Godin Tepe, which is, of course, one of the older areas as well. Haji Firuz Tepe, north of that, even older than that, and the Mesopotamian wine-growing region, especially in Uruk, which is modern-day Iraq. And then, of course, if you go back, you can see some of the other areas near Phoenicia and the area north of that. But more important too, do notice the viticultural area of the Nile Delta, and do notice that even before there was one vine planted in Western Europe, there was a North African wine industry, and that wine industry was basically the Egyptians being the vineyard owners, the Nubians generally being the indentured servants and the folks that would work the vineyards, and then the winemakers and the consultants were clearly the Canaanites. And how do we know that the Canaanites came down and planted the Nile River? Because all the vineyard designations on the vineyard designated jars of wine found by Howard Carter in 1921 in Tutankhamun's tomb, 27 jars of vineyard designated wine, basically with the cartouche of the rock star winemaker who made the wine, but then all of the vineyard designations are all written in the Canaanite language. A clear indication that the Canaanites were absolutely vitally important to viticulture within the Nile Delta in the ancient world between 3000 BCE and 6000 BCE. Pretty interesting stuff. All right, and so this is the movement of wines through history, all the way through the Roman Empire. So you see basically number one, of course, being between the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Will I say that yet one more time? Moving down into Phoenicia and Mesopotamia, over to Asia Minor, basically across down into Egypt through the Canaanites, also basically into Crete, and into Greece. Anything that the Greeks get, guess who gets Roman? That would be, of course, the Romans. Pops over to Sicily, pops up into, of course, Italy, and simultaneously moves through northern Africa. And the Carthaginians, as well as other cultures, are going to bring the culture of the grape over from North Africa into the Iberian Peninsula, modern day Portugal and Spain. And then, of course, for the first time, we see grapevines planted over the Alps when Julius Caesar makes it legal for grapes to be carried over the Alps and planted into Western Europe, into Germany, Austria, those areas, and then up into not Northern Europe, but Central Northern Europe. And of course, the climate had warmed significantly in this point, so there were grapes being grown throughout Southern England successfully and in areas above the 45th parallel of latitude, where we would only expect the grapes to be growing today, and slowly creeping north as temperatures seem to rise. So that'll give you sort of a movement of ancient grapes by virtue of the Canaanites, Phoenicians, Egyptians, the Etruscans, the Carthaginians, the Greeks, the Romans, and don't forget the birds, because the birds were obviously eating grapes and carrying them around and dropping the seeds as well. So multi species seed and grapevine dispersal. So really, the Canaanites and the Phoenicians were moving grapes around by virtue of their ability to build seagoing vessels out of Lebanese cedar. That was incredibly important, and the Canaanites and the Phoenicians were really pimping their ideas of viticulture and enology all over the ancient world in the Mediterranean. The Greeks formalized drinking within the symposium, which was a 3 or 4 hour drinking contest that would never lead to drunkenness. If it did, you would never be invited back. The Greeks believed that how we acted after 3 to 4 hours of drinking illuminated our true nature and our true greatness. If we drank and we became jerkier, we were just a jerk. And if we drank and became more brilliant, that was just illuminating our brilliance. So the Greeks believed that alcohol is a prism that basically separates and intensifies all of the all of our underlying personality. So again, they would say, if you said, I don't drink, they would say, well, probably you've got a problem, because if you can't have a few drinks, they would wonder what you were afraid of showing the world under the influence of that wine, or as the Romans would say, in vino veritas, in wine there is truth, because once more you drink, the less likely you are to have an internal filter. The symposium was so important to the development of Western democracy, in the sense that this was the symposium, 4th century BCE, Athens, Greece, all the way up to almost the Common Era, where we're talking about meetings of brilliant Athenian minds discussing and arguing and debating. And then at the end of the symposium, some type of agreement would happen, which really was one of the major forces and one of the major models for Western democracy and Athenian democracy coming out of wine drinking parties. So you could argue that certainly wine and Athens, in the way that they drank wine, did lead to the development of democracy. The Romans, you can look up these guys: Cato, Julius Caesar. Julius Caesar drank a Falernian that was almost 60 or 70 years old when he was the Caesar. And then when Caligula came to power, he drank the same vintage of Falernian, which comes from Mount Falernus. It's a sweet white wine that was considered the greatest wine of antiquity. Incredibly expensive. It probably by value would have definitely been up there with the first growths and the Grand Crus of today. The Gauls invented the wine barrel in the era, believe it or not, just at the turn of the Common Era. Julius Caesar would bring wine to the Gauls to trade. And the Gauls would empty the amphorae into bent oak barrels. And so the Gauls, which were basically the proto-French, invented the wine barrel to carry the wine up the Rhone estuary to trade for what they really wanted. They didn't keep the wine. They traded it generally for lumber and honey, because they preferred drinking mead. And the Carthaginians in Spain, obviously incredibly important in developing almost a very unique and almost insular wine culture outside of the Roman era. And the Romans were incredibly jealous of the Spaniards and the Carthaginians because they were actually making up for the amount of wine that the Romans were drinking. They were buying, I think I remember reading about 600,000 modern 750 milliliter wine bottles, or the equivalent of which were flowing from the Carthaginians as well as the Iberian Peninsula back into the Roman Empire. So one reason why the Romans went after Spain is to take the vineyards over, so they wouldn't have to continue to pay them for their wine. And then, of course, after the Roman Empire, as the Romans fled and the Roman Empire was broken up, many of the cultures that were under the Roman yoke and influence suddenly had their a little bit more sort of viticultural freedom back. And so the question is, what were they going to do with those vineyards left by the Romans? And I think my feeling is that they allowed those vineyards to mutate into different varieties that better matched the conservative nature of their indigenous food culture. So their cuisine is absolutely conservative. Cuisine of any culture is almost the most conservative aspect of that culture. So as they began to eat their indigenous culture again after the Romans left, they probably never stopped, but they wanted those wines to produce style that would match the kind of food that they were eating. So that's my sort of best guess on how post-Roman vineyards mutated to match the cuisine of those cultures, those indigenous Western European cultures. And then, of course, in the New World, the grapes that originally came over to the New World were mostly Lista Prieto, known as the mission grape, over to California to make wine. So in general, winemaking in the New World starts as a religious exercise to produce wine for the Eucharist. And then slowly becomes secularized when people learn that they don't just want to drink Jesus's blood on Sunday, but they would prefer to have a tipple and something delicious with dinner or lunch or even with breakfast every day. So we kind of began bringing over varietals to the New World that were worth drinking and not just worth making sort of communion wine and or Angelica. So it can be argued that all modern literacy and science can be poetically connected to wine, and I can do this very quickly. In 1439, Johannes Gutenberg, who used to make mirrors and metalwork for religious pilgrims, knew how to work metal. So the anecdotal story is that he went into a winery and he was watching a wine press be unloaded and noticed that the top of the wine press made an indentation on the top of the grapes. And as the cake was taken out of the dry grapes, he got this sort of Archimedes moment. He didn't run naked through the streets of Germany yelling, Eureka, I have found it. But what he did do is got himself a wine press and reworked a wine press into the world's first movable printing press. So wine technology, wine press leads to the printing press leads to literacy. You think you know where I'm going with this, you're wrong, because what I really want to talk about has to do with literacy, but has to do with lens technology. So suddenly after Johannes Gutenberg, everyone, the middle class in Europe can afford books, but what they find out is they can't see to read these books. So we need to start really producing massive amounts of spectacles, glasses. And glasses were invented about 100 years before the printing press, but the only people that would use them were monks, because monks were some of the only literate people and some of the only people that really needed to see what they were doing to produce illuminated manuscripts. So what ends up happening is before Bavaria takes off in the 17th, 18th, and 19th century as being the lens technology capital of the world, Middelburg, Netherlands, in Zeeland, in the Netherlands, in Holland, became the axis mundi, the place where lens technology was at its absolute peak in the 15th and 16th century. And something happened in Middelburg within 10 years that is miraculous. Within a 10-year period in one village in Europe, the prototype for the microscope and the telescope were both made by different individuals in the same city. The prototype for the telescope was basically worked into something we call the Dutch spyglass, which if you've ever seen a pirate movie or an oldie time sailing movie, it's basically the big spyglass, right? And the spyglass is gifted to Galileo Galilei in Italy, who turns it into the telescope and basically finds out that Copernicus was right, that we are very small in the universe. So wine technology, leads to the printing press, leads to literacy leads to lens technology, leads to an understanding of the cosmological universe. And then you take that prototype for the microscope, boom, all of a sudden it opens up the invisible world of microscopy. And suddenly we feel very big on this planet because we can see all the smaller and smaller things. And as we've moved from the compound microscope to microscopes that can go down almost to the quantum level, obviously that has absolutely changed the way that we look at the world. So Leeuwenhoek's microscope, incredibly important. Lippershey and Galileo getting the telescope working, that's incredible. And then bam, we're right back to Louis Pasteur. So we've gone pretty much through the history of wine from Pangea to Pasteur. Now we just have a couple last things to sort of close up. And that is one of my favorite charts that shows that latitude and Celsius were invented to show where we can grow grapes. Can you see this? 30 to 50 degrees of latitude is where grapes belong. 30 to 50. Like, how could something be so round and perfect? And then on top of that, between an average temperature between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius. So take the 50 to 30 degrees of latitude, both in the North and the South hemisphere, and then apply lines between 10 and 20 degrees Celsius. And that's basically where wine can be grown. Of course, with a little bit of climate change and everything else, these numbers are, but now you know why China and Russia aren't producing great wine. Look at that tiny little ribbon that goes through, but of course it widens out for Japan. And if you've ever had some of the koshu, which is a grape brought in the 15th through 17th century, somewhere around there, by the Dutch to Japan, a beautiful pink grape. Koshu is an absolutely wonderful grape being grown in Japan, and I've had some Merlot from out there that's absolutely spectacular as well. But you can see that nice big bulge that goes around Europe. You can see that nice big bulge that goes around from basically the Guadalupe Valley of Mexico all the way up to Washington State, to include the west coast of the United States. Captures some of the areas where wine can be grown on the East Coast as well. Obviously includes Texas in some areas. This doesn't say that every little place out there is going to be perfect for the production of wine, but it generally gives us an idea of where we would expect wine. Another nice big bulge around the southern half of South America, and of course captures almost all of New Zealand and what the New Zealanders like to call the Western Island, which is of course Australia. So that gives you a really cool little view of kind of winemaking. And you can find this on just a Google search. So, have we domesticated the vine, or has the vine domesticated us? And the answer, of course, is yes. Fermentation being an evolutionary miracle that brings together a vine, mildew, rot, yeast, and animals for one purpose. Why do grapes allow themselves to mildew and rot? Because it microperforates the skins on a molecular basis, just large enough for yeast to get through the skins and to ferment some grapes. So some grapes can actually ferment on the vines, very rare, but it does happen. And of course, the smell of fermentation will attract animals that weren't attracted to the fresh fruit. So if all the birds fill up their gut on fresh fruit, they may not want to eat any more fruit, but if they smell fermentation, they're going to want to get high and they're going to eat those fermented fruits. So fermentation is the second way a grapevine can trick animals into dispersing the seeds. And I strongly believe that inebriated animals would spread their seed in a more random fashion. And as we know from chaos theory and everything else, when animals spread things chaotically, sometimes that makes it a better chance for those vines to find new niche space in their environment to start a new vine. Nature wants us to consume fermented beverages. If you are a religious person, then you were given this beautiful liver with its dehydrogenase enzyme by your God. If you're a secular humanist such as myself, evolution has over millions of years worked and provided us with a way to metabolize ethanol as a normal part of our diet to make us happy, to bring us together at table. I'd like to say wine is an investment to keep the people we love at table for an extra hour every day. And whether you were created or you were evolved, or you have evolved, we have this beautiful liver and this physiology that allows us to use wine. So how lucky are we? So either let's not piss off nature by giving up on working to improve the dehydrogenase enzyme production of our livers through evolution by natural selection, or let's not anger God by saying, I'm not going to use these enzymes that you have given me. And then this beautiful idea, back to science, of hormesis. Hormesis is this idea that when you take small amounts of a toxic material into your body, it triggers molecular repair mechanisms. So one reason why wine actually may be really healthy for us is of hormesis. By drinking wine, it does remind our body to go back to work to repair ourselves. And finally, wine reminds us what nature believes is important. Does nature want us to work extra, more overtime? Does nature want us chained to a desk at work? Does nature want us to be stuck in traffic? No. What does nature want us to do? It wants us to find a hammock in the sunshine. It wants us to find a beautiful lake and have a reflective moment. It wants us to enjoy beauty. It wants us to laugh and talk with those we love. It wants us to find delicious things at table. And eventually it wants us to be naked and to either reproduce or to practice. So that's pretty much what I think wine is. It's nature's voice. And if you don't know what nature wants for you, 2 glasses of red wine in a hammock and just shut the hell up and listen. That's it. I hope you guys enjoyed my talk on the history of wine. I know it's sort of Wes Hagen's ADD theater. I'm glad you were able to last to the very end. Please stay in touch. If you want to come out to Santa Maria, all the way up to Paso Robles or anywhere in California, and you want some guidance, I'd love to set up trips for folks. I'm Julie McCoy, Cruise Director of Santa Barbara County Wine. I've written 4 of the 7 AVAs that exist in Santa Barbara. So if you're a Somm, you want questions about Santa Barbara, you want to interview me about Santa Barbara, I'm a whore for media. So please do stay in touch and know that I do a weekly wine show. On Wednesdays, we do tasting and education. And on Friday, we do a deep dive interview with folks like Karen McNeil, Terry Thies, Dan Berger, Jim Clendenin, Ken Brown, Bob Lindquist, you name it. Lots of amazingly cool people. And those are our Friday deep dive interviews. And you can catch those on my Facebook channel at J. Wilkes Wine Santa Barbara. That's it. Hope you guys enjoyed, and keep drinking, keep having fun, and let me know how I can always help you guys in the future. Thanks again. Cheers.